As a developer, design can be hard. You look at someone else's design and you know that it looks good. You look at your own design and you know that it looks, well, you know that it could look better. But knowing that it can look better is the easy part. Actually making it look better, that's another story, right? So that's why in this video, we're going to look at some super simple steps that you can take to improve the look of your projects. Hi there, my name is Kevin, and here at my channel I help teach people how to make the web and how to make it look good while they're at it with weekly tips, tricks, and tutorials. This week it's all about making things look better, and for all of these tips I am going to be doing this in CodePen. I've put a collection of the CodePens together and the link for them is down below. And for some of these I've also gone into more detail on some of these topics specifically. So if I have a video that talks about it, I'll also include the link to one of those videos down below in the description too. So design tip number one is to make sure that you're setting a max width on your text. And there's a few reasons for this, but one of them is like at small screens, our text is usually not that hard to read. But when we start getting to larger screens, a lot of developers I've seen let this happen, where the text just starts stretching from one side all the way to the other. And this makes things really hard to read. Our eye has a lot of trouble tracking when you get to here and then you're trying to get down to this next line. It's a long way for our eye to go and it makes it really hard to read. It's also much less inviting to look at in general. It makes the text look really heavy when you have these really long lines of text like this. The first one is just wrapping everything in a container, and with our container doing something like a max width of, I don't know, we'll start with 70 rem and we'll play around with it from there, and then doing a margin of 0 auto on there just so we actually have it centered on the screen. So now at this size it's the same, but when we get to that maximum size, at least it prevents it from being that full screen width. And actually this is still really big. I'm going to cut that down even smaller. The ideal line length is around 45 to 75 characters, and when you're getting to 75 it's still pretty long. So ideally you are going to be shorter than that. It does depend a little bit on the design and on other things as well. But you just want to limit these things from being really big. Another way you can do it though, is you can also come in here and actually select your text. So say your H1, your H2, your H3, so on and so forth. Anything that's a text element, paragraphs, lists, any of these. And you can give them a max width of, let's go with like 60 CH. And the CH unit stands for characters. It's roughly the width of the 0 character of a font. So think of it as max width 60 characters wide. And you can see here that my paragraphs are now shorter than my heading here. Even though this heading has the same width, it's set as a max width 60 CH, it's based on the font size of that element. And this can make some interesting layouts. It can be a nice way to actually break up really long pieces of text when you have headings that are like sticking out a little bit, just to break that wall up a little bit. But the most important thing here is, and if you don't like that, you could actually, set something a bit more firm, or your headings could have shorter max widths than your paragraphs. But setting this with your paragraphs just makes it so easy, because it's roughly 60 characters wide, and that really doesn't matter on the font size. If I come in here, let's just do our paragraphs for now. If I say that my paragraph has a font size of, we'll go with 2 rem just to make it really big, but just to show you that we're ending at the word sequi here. And if we drop that down to a 1, we're probably going to be roughly in the same. It's a little bit off, you can see here. So not quite the same, but let's go up to a 1.5 emit, and then we have the emit there still. So the 2 might have been too big and it was hitting that maximum width probably. But by doing this, if we drop that to 2.5, it should be the same word. There you go. So we can see that it's based really on the amount of characters in a line rather than anything else, which can make it really easy, and you don't even have to think about it. It just is going to be a nice line length. Whatever you do, even if you're not using CH, you're just using, even if it's you're just setting a max width on your container, just make sure you're stopping things from stretching and being super, super wide. And if we need our eye to go all the way across, and this is a big screen I'm on now, but even if it's an iPad and the text is going all the way across, it doesn't look great. Moving on to tip number 2 is let things breathe. And part of that is definitely coming in with your container and setting the, something like this up where we have a 60. Let's say, so here, like we have some breathing room on the left and the right, but everything on this design still feels really cramped and really, it doesn't feel comfortable yet. And the first place I'm going to suggest this actually is at small screen sizes. Just make sure on a container you either have a width that's less than 100%, so it's not touching the sides of the screen, or you put a little bit of padding on it, just so you get a space. So even if this is, you could probably go up as big as 2M depending on the design. Maybe that's a bit big, but just giving yourself some space on the edges so the text isn't touching it. Because I've come across many professionally done sites that on small screens, the text is actually touching the edge of the screen when I'm reading something on my phone. And it just doesn't look great. It makes it more awkward to read. It looks like the text is going to fall off the side of the page. So just coming in here with a little bit of, 0 top and bottom, 1 M left and right, just to give myself breathing room in small sizes is a really good start. At the small sizes here too, just be careful. Like this should not be, this shouldn't be columns, but they should, ideally those would be stacking, but not a big deal. But once we get to like here, things are they're so jammed and smushed together. So the first place I'm going to start is with this actually, where these columns, we don't see how like when it's hard to tell that they're even like which column is what. And visually we need these columns to breathe a little bit more. So where I have my display flex, I'm going to come in here with a gap of 1M. Just to put a little bit of breathing room. Actually, I'm going to exaggerate with 3 here just to really put some space between them. Maybe that's a bit much. But we really want to have space around these columns that's being created. And if you didn't know, Flex Gap does work with Flex. It's not fully supported yet. I have some videos on that. I put a link in the description about this, but also a fallback you can use as we wait for browser support to increase. But it's really nice having this spacing that's on there so our elements don't look like they're smushed together. Because if we have no space between items like that, they all just sort of meld into one another. It makes it really hard for the visitor of your site to distinguish these pieces of information. It just looks like one big mess of information. Whereas if I come in here with my gap, now because there's space in between each one of them, it just makes it really easy. I see 1, 2, 3, nice, easy. It's really nice. It's easy for me to see those 3 columns. But everything is still a little bit smushed. We need things to breathe even more. Another way we can do it is if you have a background, whether it's a background image, a background color, always get some padding on that guy. So in this situation, I don't really need any on the left and the right because I'm using my container to hold everything. So I'm just going to come in here with padding on the top and bottom. Let's go with like 5 rem top and bottom, 0 left and right. And that just helps this whole area breathe even more than it did before. You can see it's created the space here, but it's still really jammed with those. So let's come in and add some margin to this as well. We'll do the same numbers, 5 rem, 0. And now we get this clear piece of information here. Then we get this guy right here. Then we see that there's another block of information here. We're splitting things up for the visitor of the site to be able to see these clear blocks of text and these clear blocks of information as they're coming through on the site. It just makes things a lot easier to go through, a lot easier to distinguish, less cognitive load. You're not thinking about trying to find the information. You're now looking and really easily being able to find the different pieces. And it just makes things so much more airy and light and everything, and more pleasant to look at as well. And speaking of that, one last thing I'm going to say is for paragraphs and body text in general, this whole let it breathe thing also comes in. So I'm going to actually, I don't have a selector for it here yet. So on the body, having a line height that's not the default 1.4 is probably a good thing. We want to space our paragraph text out a little bit. It also makes things easier to read. So like a 1.5 to a 1.6, depending on the font and the font size and other things, can make a really big difference and make things much more readable. The only downside when you do this, if you are setting it on your body, which I usually do, is when you get to these bigger texts, like your headings, when these go on multiple lines, the spacing is actually a bit too much. So then often what I would have after declaring something like that is my H1, H2, H3. They'll have a line height of like a 1.1 or something like that, because with the bigger font sizes, you actually want them to be a little closer together. It makes it, again, easier to read. You can see that this is one block of information, and then we're getting to this here. And let's just turn this off for a second, just so you can see the difference with this block. You can see how here it looks really jammed together. It's really tight. Whereas if I come on this one and I just lighten, it lightens the whole thing up. It makes these lines more inviting to read. And if you have content, the idea for that content is people should be consuming it, they should be reading it. So we want to invite them to do that as much as possible with something like that. Now, before we get to the next tip, I want to let you know that this video is being brought to you by none other than Skillshare. I've talked about them many times before because I really do think they have quality classes that can help you out. If you're looking to improve your website's design, they have a fantastic class called Web Design Essentials, Creating a Marketing Homepage that Drives Results. It's by Dennis Field of InVision, and what I love about it is it doesn't only talk about the design itself, but the thought process leading up to that design. So this is like including setting goals and how you're going to reach those goals, as well as telling a story, and all of that's before jumping into and then finally creating a concept and design. And that's just one of thousands of awesome classes that you can take on Skillshare. If you sign up for an annual membership, it's less than $10 a month and you'll get unlimited access to all of their classes plus hands-on projects that come with them. These classes aren't only limited to design either, with classes on UI, UX, development, freelancing, and more. If you'd like to try them out, the first 1,000 people who use the link in the description of this video will get a free trial to their premium membership. A huge thank you to Skillshare for their support, and now let's dive back into the next tip. All right, so let's move on to the next tip, which is contrast with color. You can see here it's a very monochromatic website, but beyond that, we're really missing out on a lot of contrast, and I actually see designers make this mistake a lot with very low contrast on some text, because sometimes it can actually look pretty nice, but we do have to be careful with that as well, because we want to make sure things are also readable, and there's sort of minimum contrast that we should be keeping in mind. I'm not going to dive too much into the minimum contrast idea, but this idea of having contrast with color is really important. And so the first thing I'm going to do is the easy fixes. Or actually, let's just go look. We'll look really quickly at the contrast. So in Chrome, it's really easy to get. You'd go to your little inspector tool here, and it shows you the contrast. And I can see here it's giving me a warning saying that that contrast, I can't move my mouse, but it's showing me that that contrast is too low and that this is a problem. It's going to be hard for some people to read. So we do want to make sure that that number is held high enough. So let's start there. So my background in this case, let's bring it a lot brighter. The text, let's make it a lot darker. So we start getting contrast, and that's just so much easier to read. We can do the same thing with my dark background here. So the background can go darker, the text can get closer, even if you're doing like a CCC, maybe a DDD, something like that, just to make it closer to white. It makes it a lot easier to read, and then we can go and check it out. And now we can see we get a nice little check mark saying that we're pretty good on our contrast. Amazing. But we can do more than that, because what I've done right now is I've made it easy to read, and that's the first step. This is the most important one. But now we can create more contrast with color. So one way we can create contrast with color without needing to worry about color itself is just going with shades of gray. So maybe up here, instead of 333, let's try a 555 and see if that actually passes on our contrast test here. And we're getting a check mark. So the number there, 6.43, is getting a little bit low, but we're not in the, we're not in the danger zone too much yet. And maybe even we could even make this like an EF, 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 just to brighten up the background, increase the overall contrast a little bit. Or we could even go all the way up to white to really make sure that we can see that enough. But then what I could do is also come on my headings, H1, H2, H3, and say that the color on those is black, or it doesn't have to necessarily be black. But by doing that, I'm creating, here I broke things a little bit, but here I'm creating an extra bit of contrast between my title here and between this text here, because there is a difference in the color. This is grabbing my attention a lot more than when I didn't have it. And again, ignore this middle bar here right now. But if we have it set up, so you can see down here where, let's scroll down, you can see here, like it's not bad, this big bold font. It's obviously standing out more than the regular paragraph text here. But if I come and I make that color black, all of a sudden this pops off the page just a little bit more, makes it easier if you're skimming through the text, things like that. Creates a little bit extra contrast with color, even though the colors are still in the black, whites, and grays. So let's fix this one in the middle here. So the same idea where my color is DDD. And then what we could say is that my BG dark H2, my .bg dark H3 have a color of FFF. So that way they're popping off the page just a little bit more than this light gray that we have there. So we're continuing that idea of having a little bit of extra contrast to help guide the user. Now, of course, if we have something like this and it's black, it's one thing, it's giving us a punch, but you could obviously come in here with, say, like a 09A, or it depends on your color scheme and everything, but that's going to add punches too, and it also helps attract the eye. But you don't have to be adding color necessarily to create that extra contrast. Heading on over to tip number 4. This one is one that's more important in certain circumstances than others, but in general, I would just say don't use justify text. If the general rule for typography is if you're doing justify text, you need to have hyphenation. So there are JavaScript libraries you could actually use to add to add this in there. And if that's the case, maybe you can get away with it. Now, I don't know if it's worth it or not. That's up to you to decide based on the performance and all of that might come out of it. You might get a performance hit, I'm not sure. But the reason we don't want to do it is if you have really long lines of text, it's not usually the end of the world, but we already saw long lines of text aren't the best thing in the world. And what happens is you can already see it in these columns that I have here where the spacing looks a little bit weird, right? And then as I make this narrower, like even now this heading is looking really weird because it's a justified heading. And the narrower I make this, the more things fall apart. And you're on a phone and then all of a sudden you start like, avoid justified text because look at that space right there. And look at this, like you get these giant spaces that start coming up at smaller screen sizes. It just looks really awkward. It's much, much, much nicer to have all of that space being this ragged side here. It makes it easier to read. It makes it look like normal spacing than that weird stuff that you get when you use the justify. So, you know, yeah, you get nice clean edges, but if you're not hyphenating text, you're not allowed to justify text. We actually, you know, in most design software that does allow for it, it's hyphenation and justification. It's in the same part of the settings because you need both of them working together to get it to work properly and to avoid this really awkward stuff where that happens. So avoid using text-align justify. Just don't use it unless, you know, just don't use it. And the other thing that I see people do a lot is too much text-align center as well. So yes, you can use text-align center, but you want to limit where you're using it. And when you, again, getting long lines of text like this, it makes it really hard to read. The same reason, and this doesn't even have to be an overly long line to read. If you have a block, like a whole bunch of text that's all center aligned, it's very difficult to read. You get to the end of one line, again, it's harder for your eye to track because both sides end up being like this weird wiggly thing, right? Like down here, it starts getting really awkward to read this. It doesn't, maybe you like the visual look of it, but if you have text, it's not about the visual look, it's about making it easy to read. And a text-align center makes things harder to read, much harder to read. So where you could use center-aligned text, and where you usually see it if you're looking at other sites, is in smaller areas. So text center, and there I'll throw a text align center on that one. And that's just going to be this area with these little short pieces of text. It's not the end of the world. It's still easy enough to read because they're very short. You can sort of quickly look at them and it's fine. But when you have long pieces of text like you have here, please don't use the center aligned text. And whatever you're doing, I can't think of a good reason why on the web you would need to have justified text, so don't even worry about it. And again, if you really must have it, look into the JavaScript libraries that you can use to add in hyphenation. Now let's move on into tip number 5, which is looking at contrast again, but instead of contrast through color, it's contrast with fonts. And I say fonts because I wanted to look at multiple things here. One of them is font weight. So right now I've set all the font weights to 300, so this is the same as this. Whereas, you know, we could jump this all the way up to 900 and get a nice big bold font on our headings, and that helps create contrast. We're making two different pieces of information. My headings are bold, my other text is not bold. So we're creating that separation. It makes it easier for the user when they're on the page. It also creates more visual interest for the most part. But we can take this another step too. One thing that I see people that become very scared is going in with like bigger font sizes. And other things. So you get a title, like having a big title, there's nothing wrong with that. And then having your H2, and again, you can see the line height there maybe needs to be decreased, but we'll go with a font size on my H2s of like 4 rem. And in areas, you know, like maybe, or we'll try a 3, but like having these big titles like this, it helps. Like I find this more visually interesting now, and now we can go down to our H3s and we can have our font size here of 2 rem. And it's increasing that just by a little bit, but here you can see how this is grabbing my eye and it's leading me through this page a lot better than it was before with these really quick things that I just did. And if I decrease my line height here again, like we looked at before, we'll do a 1.1 again. Just to help make these more like blocks of content, or maybe even a 1 on this would work. And on the paragraphs, we could come in. So on my, we'll just do paragraph for now. I usually set this on my body, but line height of a 1.5. And just to create that, and like it's starting to come together. This design doesn't look terrible anymore, right? It's starting to look a little bit nicer. The bigger font size, the big bold on there really can help. Now with the font sizes like this, the one thing I'd be careful with is that small screen sizes, it can definitely cause issues. So this is a situation where on small screens where you don't have as much real estate, you definitely want to have smaller font. The ratio between your font sizes will be smaller, but when you start getting to bigger screens, you have more room to play with, you can go really big with your fonts. So big, bold fonts, there's nothing wrong with that. Makes a statement, it increases your contrast a bit, and it makes it easier to follow. And I'm exaggerating maybe here a little bit. You don't have to go this big with things. But when you do have a bigger contrast in font sizes, it just creates a bit more visual interest, and it does make it easier for the user on the page. And if you want a really easy type scale, setting it all up with custom properties, you can just change all of your font sizes you change your custom property inside of a media query, and all of the font sizes will adjust automatically. It's just wonderful. It's so nice. It's one of my favorite things to do with custom properties because of how simple it is. And there we have it. I really hope that these tips will help you out and get you putting some really awesome looking sites and projects together. If you do have a project that you've put together and you're sort of happy with it, but you're looking for some feedback, I'm starting to do some live streams where I review people's projects. There is a specific channel in my Discord that's going to be set up to submit projects. It's currently locked, it's closed, you can't post anything yet. But if you join the Discord, you can ask for a notification role, so when that channel does open up for you to submit projects, you'll get notified. If you don't want to wait around and wait for me to give you some feedback on stuff, there is a channel in the community that's dedicated to UI and UX feedback, so you could head on over there as well. Or if you're looking for help with code rather than UI and UX feedback, there's channels for that as well. And all of these channels are full of really helpful people, and I drop in as much as I can as well. Thank you so much for watching. A giant thank you to my patrons for their support each and every month. And of course, until next time, don't forget to keep on making your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.